Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, founder and executive director of the Center for Black Literature and director of the National Black Writers Conference at Medgar Evers College. And this is Writers on Writing, is paid for by Medgar Evers College. And we come to you each Sunday and give you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from all parts of the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. I'm very, very pleased to have with me on the radio this evening, and also for those of you who will be reviewing this, Rachel Eliza Griffiths. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, Dr. Greene. Thank you so much for having me.
But thank you so much for agreeing to come. Rachel Eliza Griffiths is a poet and visual artist and novelist. She's also a recipient of the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and the Patterson Poetry Prize, and a finalist for the NAACP Image Award. She has many, many fellowships, which include Cave Canem, the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, Yaddo, and many more. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Tin House, and many other outlets. And I'm very, very pleased to be speaking with her about her first novel, a wonderful novel, one that I had difficulty putting down, called Promise, a novel. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And you had a lot of praise. You're well known as a poet. This is your first novel. But one of the statements that really struck me is from Marlon James. And I think that he captured what you do. He said, "This is a magical, magnificent novel that amounts to a secret history of an America we think we know, but never really knew, where girls reckon with the beauty and terror of girlhood. Mortal Black bodies reckon with immortal Black souls, and America reckons with the terror of its beastly, bloody self. The result bowls us over with shock and grief, but eventually fills our hearts with awe and wonder." It's a lot to grasp, many layers there.
Yes, very much so.
Yes, yes, and that's Marlon James. But why don't you start by giving us a brief synopsis of Promise and what motivated you to write that?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Promise is a historical story that begins in 1957 in a small, remote sea village town in Maine. There are two sisters, Cynthia and Ezra. Cynthia is the hero of the story. It's her story. And Cynthia is coming of age alongside her sister in a very hostile sea village where the momentum of the civil rights is gaining all across America. And she and her sister are kind of looking at their lives, looking at her family, her parents who have raised her, and trying to make sense of who they belong to. And that includes them belonging to themselves and their own dreams and desires and futures as the world is telling them what they should be and what they should have and what they feel in their hearts. And so the novel is about the exploration of what promises are made to us, particularly Black women and Black girls, from this country, America, from our family, and then the promises and things we keep internally inside of ourselves as far as our own dreams and demands and truth telling that we know to be. Um, I wanted to follow Cynthia through a very hard kind of journey where she emerges as a survivor. Even in the face of hardship, she's able to kind of come through singing and be reconnected and rejoined to a greater sense of her family and who she is. So by the novel's end, she has claimed and planted herself in the identity and the wealth of her family and what their lives have been sacrificed for her to know.
Okay. And
Mhm.
so why were you motivated to tell that story?
This story has lived in me, Dr. Greene, for I want to say maybe a decade at least. It took me about 7 years to write Promise. What I now know, looking through old journals of mine, that I had the word promise as the title of a story, and there were different stories and different characters. But this word had kind of haunted me or been in my system for many, many years. I think when my mother passed away in 2014, that was the call of clarity to me that this story about these sisters and this sea village and these girls who are trying to know themselves needed to kind of come together. And I think the loss of my mother was the inspiration for me to really sit down and decide to go forward and trust myself, trust the story, trust the characters, trust that I was also at a state as a writer where I could manage the material that I wanted to approach, which is quite difficult in the novel. So I would say, I wanted to write this love letter, particularly to Black girls and Black women. And as I grieved my mother, this story became a space where I could reclaim things for my own childhood and my own girlhood, but for other Black girls and Black women and Black families too.
Right. And it's interesting that you say that because as I read the story, it just kept coming to me about the fact that there must be so many autobiographical elements in the story. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that, or do you want to share to what extent that this may also be autobiographical? And I had to remember that this is not your memoir.
Yeah. No, it's not a memoir, but it's that thing that writers often talk about is that, whatever you make is personal. Whatever you make has some mirror or seed of who you are and your
Yes.
experiences in it. I know from my sister's reading of the book, she can say, like, I see you, you're here and you're there. And I'll be like, what are you talking about? Because it's so I write from a very unconscious, intuitive space. And so things that I may not see right in front of me are coming, they're still coming through that portal and that channel. I do think Cynthia's love of education and books, her, desire to kind of immerse herself in the library, to learn as much as possible. She's a voracious reader. She
Yes.
questions everything around her. I know that I shared that from myself directly to her because I think it equipped her with a power of observation of the adults and the community around her, and that she could kind of call things as she saw them and trust that she was intelligent enough to trust her own voice. So I do feel, I was born in Washington D.C. I grew up in Delaware, which is a kind of isolated state.
Mhm.
There's there's a lot of natural beauty there in Delaware, but it's not like Washington D.C. or
Right.
New York or somewhere else. So it could kind of feel as a child a little bit isolating. But I also love the fact that with fiction, I could kind of take the characters into all kinds of environments that I wouldn't necessarily have access to, and that includes spiritual environments.
Right. And then also, just going back to that, I'm going to come back to the spiritual environment, but you chose to write this during the civil rights era. So you have so many themes, the themes of the civil rights, the migration, the
Mhm,
history,
mhm,
enslavement, of course, racism, the privileging of whites. I mean, you just have so many themes that you pack into this story.
mhm.
So it's really also an historical novel, and it's
Mhm.
also so poetic. I just love the language. I
Thank
was
you.
just really. So you talked about your keen powers of observation. So let's we'll come back to the history and the themes, but I want you to talk a little bit about how your background as a poet and as a visual artist
Mhm,
help to shape the language you use, help to influence the way that you structured the story, the novel, and
mhm,
told the novel.
mhm. And thank you for all of that. I, the attention to every sentence and the function of language was a primary element or almost innate, organic, necessary thing for me as a writer. It always is. The language really has to be working at a certain level. And as a poet, this is critical to, writing a poem that does what it does to your mind and your heart. So, how to carry that inseparable relationship between heart and mind into a prose narrative. How can that work? How can a sentence leave you breathless? How can the description of setting or a dialogue be breathtaking and give you that kind of almost gasp that poems can give you when you come out of them? I wanted that for this book. Um, Going back for a moment when you spoke about autobiography, long before I would have called myself a poet, I knew that I was a novelist or a writer. That's I blame this like linear thing that has happened to me just on kind of being a younger woman writer and being able to publish my poetry first before my prose. But I'm glad now that I didn't rush with my prose. I'm glad that I graduated from Sarah Lawrence College with an MFA in fiction writing in 2006. And any prose or any kind of fiction or thing that I wrote, I pretty much wouldn't let anybody see that. I just worked on it and
Interesting.
worked on it and
Mhm.
worked on it. What did happen to me when I went to Sarah Lawrence is that I began, while I was taking fiction classes, to take poetry classes for the first time. Even though I read a lot of poetry, I was very sensitive of like, poetry is just in literature, it just sits on this throne and I can't get there. And then I had really good teachers and I had Cave Canem and I had the New York literary scene, in 2004 and 2003 and teaching at Medgar Evers and just, being really immersed all around me with poets and began to feel that maybe I had some things to share in the form of poetry that that could come into the world even as I was still trying to study novels, study writing, and figure that out. And so, what has happened now, which is wonderful, is that there isn't particularly a separation. It's very blurry for me, the box of here's the novelist and here's the poet.
Mhm.
For me, they really are kind of, it's like the heart and the mind for me.
Yes.
They function together, organs inside the same vessel, needing each other. And so sometimes, I would work on promise and the language would maybe start to feel pedestrian and the poet would pull me back and say,
Mhm.
what's going on here with this sentence?
Right.
And then other times I would get so lost in these, elevated sentences and language that the novelist would say, well, what is going on here? Everyone is going to be lost. You've lost your reader a chapter ago because you're writing about, the sky for 4 pages. Like we have
Yes.
pacing and all of that. And so they made this really, the poet in me and the prose writer in me made this really, I think, wonderful song together. And it works best because it became very simple after a while, where the seams weren't showing anymore and that they were really blended together, and that they weren't fighting each other. Whereas when I was younger, I didn't talk very much about writing fiction or prose at all. And then the presence of the visual arts as being primarily a photographer, I would say maybe that is like a sky or umbrella around the other two mediums. Whereas many times while writing promise, I literally had my eyes closed and would just type, and I would just see like, here is Cynthia, and she's at her house, and she's sitting at the table with her family. This is the tablecloth. Um, Nat Cole is on the radio. Her father looks like this. The mother, this is how the bread smells. This is what the sky looks like. The sun's going down. This is the sound of the birds. And I would have my eyes closed and I would just, what I saw almost in a cinematic way, allowed me to make the language very visual and very graphic because that's how I am both as a poet and as a novelist. Imagery is really important, as important as the sense of the lyric in poetry and in prose.
Right. I love the way you describe that. I think, when you teach writing, and I'm sure as, teaching writing and even analyzing poetry and literature, just getting people to understand the way the writer is deliberately selecting words in order
Mhm.
to convey certain emotions and a certain tone and image that just came across so well.
Mm.
I want you to talk a little bit about the names because I kept doing this double take. Kindred, the family is called Kindred, and then like it was really Miss Burden. So these
Yes.
names, the names of the characters, is that something you deliberately spend a lot of time thinking about? Is there any story you can share around why you chose certain names? And even the biblical names. You talked about it being very spiritual. There's a lot of spirituality in
Mhm.
this novel. There are references to the Bible and to history. Want to
Mhm.
share your thoughts about that?
Yes, I'm happy to. I've always been fascinated, with naming. And I think if you're someone whose life is dedicated to language and words, then the names of people, places, things, spirits is a very potent space. Um, outright, the name Kindred is a praise song to Octavia Butler right
Yes,
away. Um, at the same time, the name also functions in its relationship to the haunted history that the family is recovering from. Um, and the idea of kinship in the novel, and how this family is almost removed from traditional sense of kinship. They are removed from a certain sense of spirituality where they have tradition, but at the same time, because of things that have happened to the family, all of this is on kind of uneven ground for them. So sometimes they are believing and trusting in religion and know that they need it. And then other times they're worried that it may be part of the reason why they are in the environment and in the history that they are living. Um, I loved Cynthia's name, this name Hyacinth. um, I think many, many years ago, I met a Black woman named Hyacinth, and
okay.
I never forgot that woman, and I just also thought about the beautiful mother she must have had to just name her Hyacinth. Um, and she didn't have it was Hyacinth, it was not
Mhm,
Cynthia, it was Hyacinth.
mhm.
Um, the biblical history of the name Ezra and how it is a kind of shape shifting kind of name across multiple religious faiths, this word and this story. And then if you think of, the white character in the book, her name's Ruby, um,
Yes,
which is kind of, almost a typical name at that time. But Ruby ends up being a kind of rough gem in the novel.
yes.
And um, she's not this kind of precious stone. She's really on the opposite side. And she aspires to be thought of as the way and treasured the way a ruby might be. And she's not. Um, and a lot of the characters have this kind of tension with their names. Cynthia's mother wants to be called Lena, like, the movie star at that time,
Yes.
versus her mother naming her Jolene, which is a very country and earthy kind of name. And so there's this play of kind of pushing against names, um, absorbing names, renaming, switching through names. And that's just always been, I'm just someone who will always just be taken with how people get nicknames, how these things arrive. The place where Cynthia returns and kind of has a homecoming is called Damascus. And
Yes.
it's based on a journey in the South in Mississippi. I was making photographs and found in this really dusty road, this small, white, black church called Damascus.
Oh,
And it
okay.
was, based on, like, a real experience of it being a Sunday and hearing worship happening in this, like, place that almost seemed like it was out of a William Faulkner novel, and it was called Damascus. And, being there and witnessing that moment deep in the South, with Black people worshiping and being safe. I wanted to put that into the book for me as a reminder. But I also come from Delaware, which also has a kind of southernness to the lower part of it. So there are a lot of layering that happens with the names. The only Black family in,
Yes,
Salt Point, the father's name is Caesar, you know,
yes,
and that's very, very deliberate,
yes, okay. So, I thought about, as a writer, you are in conversation with other writers, and you want to talk about, and I talk about how fat writers really enter into conversation. So this is really another way of asking, who has influenced you, but who do you think, if you were in a room, who are you in conversation with respect to the themes, and who are the writers who have influenced you?
Mm. This is such a great question, and it's for me, it's a very fluid space based on whatever is kind of present with me. I think without a doubt, Zora Neale Hurston is someone for promise. I would say I felt her presence as I'm writing about these two young Black girls coming of age, really thinking back to that scene, and their eyes were watching God, where Janie's granny tells her, you can't be the pear blossom, you're going to be the mule, and that's what Black women are going to be in this world. And then Janie, of course, setting forth to defy that and not accept that and feel that she is a flower and deserves that richness and sweetness and lushness of her own life. I certainly feel as a poet, kind of the earthiness and trust of intuition in the work and writing of Lucille Clifton is evident in the writing for Promise. I feel as though, Toni Morrison, who remains a um, great clarion, a great force of generosity and brilliance and truth telling and reckoning, lives in the book. And I think in my effort to write this love letter to Black girls and Black womanhood, I definitely am speaking to Black women writers whose shoulders I stand on,
Yes.
and who I wouldn't be present without Audre Lorde or June Jordan or Toni K. Bambara or Marie Evans or Jane Cortez or Sonia Sanchez. There wouldn't be Promise, because I wouldn't have known I could dare write the kind of book that this book is. Um, and so, having this village of Black women writers, Alice Walker, I mean, it just, Margaret Walker, Nella Larson, all of them are in me. And so I feel they're in this book. Um, and
That-
my studies as a poet, being a professor, being a novelist, being a photographer, the presence of even Black women visual artists like Faith Ringgold, like that's in there. Betty Saar, that's in Promise. And so, I I feel as lonely as it can be, which is different from poetry, which feels much more social. The solitude of writing a novel, especially over the course of, say, 7 or 8 years, you're really not alone as much as you are alone, but you aren't. And if you're listening, which I felt I was all of the time, voices arrive. James Baldwin arrives
uh-huh.
and says, "What's up, little sister? Keep going. You got this." And you're reading and you have books spread around you, and you're listening to things, and you need to be present, and you need to rely on ancestors at the same time, because that's how you're going to make it through the journey.
Oh, I love your description of that.
Okay.
Um, I want to go back for a moment to the theme of the promise or promise, and also the path. And you speak a lot about the path and how Black people are moving toward the path, which I think really connects with the promise, and also connects with the theme of our upcoming conference. Um, where do we go from here? All that we carried, where do we go from here? You want to talk about the path and what that
Mhm.
has meant for the Black family and the Black experience in America.
I feel as though as we continue to receive really beautiful narratives and stories, about, this kind of path, but also off the path, beyond the path, spaces where the path was not carved out, and getting to know more and more and hear stories, fiction, memoir, nonfiction, essays, biographies of different people's narratives. It's always been interesting to me to think about how I was raised, where there was this kind of certain path. Often on that path would be, the first person to do this, the
Yes.
first person to do that. There was also the sense of, if you're walking this path, there is also an adjacent path that is very white and segregates you and excludes you, where if you're on your path, you have had to work and accomplish things at twice or triple or quadruple the capacity that someone on the other path just has a birthright to access.
Mhm.
So I'm interested in how the path can sometimes feel like a certain birthright. And at the same time, it can be a real ambivalent intersection of class, race, sexual orientation, um, diaspora migration, how to claim this path. You and I are speaking the day after celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And yesterday was a day in particular that I was kind of looking at quotations, looking at speeches, looking at the way a certain perspective during civil rights movement, with Dr. King and other folks was being presented like, this is the path, this is the mission, this is keeping our eyes on the prize, this is the
Yes.
price of the ticket, that kind of work. And at the same time, to be a writer, contemporary Black woman writer in 2024 now, what does it mean to try to carry that tradition and that history, and to acknowledge the difficult, pervasive presence of many, many different wars on many different fronts right now for Black people and people of color globally? Um, and how does a writer manage to say the things one needs to say? When does the path prevent generations from expressing what they may need to express? Um, when is it important for everybody to listen to each other and try to really come together? What does it mean to try to come toward each other in the face of a nation right now that seems to just really be backtracking in a very deliberate way
Yes.
to a great America that completely relied on the oppression and, um, you know, harassment and violence and deaths of Black people, and to make that the promise for the America that is now everyone's nostalgic for, except people who were, who had someone putting a foot on their neck. And so there's a real hardship of knowing what to say, how to say, if you have the right to say anything, um, and feeling sometimes, talking to people and wondering, have they read the history and what did they come away from it? And that we can all have access to similar books or text and really come away with a really different understanding and interpretation of what those texts signify. And so for me, growing up, there was this kind of path, this word excellence,
Yes.
accomplishment, achievement. At the same time, there's now this kind of um, wonderful energy where I would say younger generations want to return to, say, HBCUs and go back to places that sustain and foster Black culture. There are other places, people of color who are saying like college is too expensive. Like that it's not affordable. I have to live with my mother. I have to work two, three, four jobs. I can't go to college right now. They don't even want to have, special admissions. They don't want to try to level this out. And when you start to even examine, and I know you and I, definitely can relate to this, the attack of Black women in these institutions of
Yes.
higher learning, the war on Black women, you think about this path. You think about the promises that were made to you that if you dedicated your life to this energy, there would be a kind of security. Perhaps there would be a certain kind of respectability. But a lot of that now has really been thrown up in the air. Um, and there's not a monolithic statement. There's not like this is good or bad. It's too complex to
No,
really qualify.
right,
And so I stay up really watching, thinking, worrying, thinking about young people and what's coming next for them. And do I have something meaningful to say in the art that I am committed to writing and seeing and living? What can I do? Because there's also too like our mental health, our physical health. Again, Black women, mortality rates for Black babies being born, looking at diabetes, stroke, heart attack, Black women just, dropping dead
right.
from exhaustion. So you put all of these things together and then you still try to think, how can I keep going?
How do you keep going?
How do
And
you
that's
keep
what your book
going?
offers, that
Mhm,
we're going to have all of this. We can't get away from all of this
mhm,
disaster, all of
mhm.
the pain, all of the grief, all of the anger.
Grief.
We cannot get away from this,
Mhm,
but we have to hold on to something. And I think the promise, offers a way. So I
mhm.
really thank you. It's forced us to look at things in a different way. I don't know if people can see, the lighting may not be good, but I encourage our listening audience to go out. Oh, yours is much better because of the background. To go out and purchase Promise. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
It's beautifully written. It just raises so many issues and so many themes, and I congratulate you for writing it. And I want our listening audience to remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Embody yourselves as readers and writers. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. And look out for the work of Rachel Eliza Griffiths, who's put her heart into this novel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green, and I appreciate everything you do and continue to do for our community. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. And this radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers College.